Hello and welcome to Legally Speaking with me, Tarun Nagia. Today, we discuss a topic that is keen to what is an important base of the Indian economy. As business grows, as investment grows, there will be a need for mergers and acquisitions. And that is where competition lawyers do a lot of work. And today, we're going to discuss the recent amendments that have been enforced in the Competition Act and what impact will it have on the M&A, which is a merger and acquisition environment in India. To discuss that, I've got somebody who has an expertise in this subject. I would like to welcome Shweta Shaw Chopra. She is partner in the competition law practice at law firm Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, which, as you know, is one of India's leading law firms. She's also a member of the firm's management board. Good to see you, Shweta, and looking forward to an interesting discussion on the recent amendments to the competition law.
Thanks for having me, Tarun. Indeed, it's a very topical time to discuss the recent amendments to the Competition Act, which are exactly a month old as of today. And a lot has shifted between the previous regime and now. And, the ripple effects are going to come through over the next couple of months, and a lot more clarity will emerge on various topics. But sort of briefly, just for your audience, I would like to sort of summarize the key amendments. The first major amendment is the deal value threshold. So until now, the CCI has looked at mergers and acquisitions where the jurisdictional thresholds, which are asset or turnover based, cross a certain threshold which is specified. And if they cross that threshold, then the transaction requires CCI approval. Now, in addition to the thresholds provided for in the Competition Act, the government had brought in a small targets exemption, where if the target had either turnover or assets below a certain number in India, then those transactions, irrespective of the overall thresholds being met, would not require notification because the target was way too small. Now, as a result of this, it appears that there have been certain transactions which were not caught in the net, because they are either in the high-tech sector or the infrastructure sector, where sometimes the assets are light, or other times the revenue hasn't really fructified. But that doesn't really kind of give you an accurate picture of the competitive dynamics of that transaction. And oftentimes these transactions have been valued at some crazy multiples and very earth-shattering numbers. So in order to kind of work around sort of skipping out of these transactions getting missed from review or escaping review, the CCI, after the CLRC committee in 2019, has now brought into force a deal value threshold. So you'll ask me, what is a deal value threshold? There is a 2,000 crore deal value threshold. So if the transaction is valued at 2,000 crores and value of the transaction will be looked at in the most broad possible way, and the target has substantial business operations in India, which is either 10% of turnover, global turnover, or 10% of global GMV, or 10% of business users or end users, as the case may be for digital services companies, then that transaction would be caught even if the small target exemption would have been available. So it kind of takes away the small target exemption for companies where the deal values are much more significant than the assets or turnover. So that's the first and the most talked about one so far, because importantly, the regulations, the changes which have been brought in on 10th of September, they apply to all ongoing transactions which have not closed. So everything has had to be reassessed. There has been no grandfathering as such, of ongoing transactions which have signed before the regulations came into force, which actually took everybody by surprise, I must say. So there is a lot of ongoing assessment of transactions which are signed but not yet closed, going on to see whether those which had previously not required notification are now caught within the net. In addition to this, I think that another key salient change has been shortened review timelines. Now, in the Competition Act, initially it was 210 days for overall review and approval of the transaction, and that overall timeline has been now shortened to 150 days. However, this is also further bifurcated into the phases of review of the combination, as they call it. And in phase one, which used to be 30 working days with certain exclusions, now that has been reduced to 30 calendar days. And additionally, what is important is that at the end of this 30 calendar days, if the CCI does not find, does not find a reason for issuing a show cause notice, then the transaction would be deemed approved. Now, this has come on the back of a lot of criticism of the timelines which our parties are facing at the CCI, even though their sort of official numbers are at 17 and 21 days over the last few years. But typically, a lot of information is requested, and every time information is requested from the parties, the clock gets stopped. So that time period actually translates to, between 60 to 90 days, sometimes even more. So looking at all those factors, these timelines are going to pose certain challenges for the CCI. Once sort of the floodgates open, I guess, we are still in early days. So therefore, I think operational efficiency and taking a pragmatic view to transactions, where to deep dive and where to take a, back of the envelope approach, is something that I think the CCI will have to pay attention to. And the third and the last one, which we will talk about in more detail over this interview, is the derogation for on-market transactions. And that is that previously on-market transactions, such as bulk and block trades, as well as open offers, you couldn't do a stake build without CCI approval. But as you know, that on-market transactions are time sensitive, price sensitive, and the whole CCI approval process could actually, dent the commercial intent and also the feasibility of the transaction. And as a result of that, the CCI, after the CLRC committee report, has introduced in the Competition Amendment Act, and now it is law, is a derogation so that you don't need prior approval before the on-market transaction, provided certain other conditions are met. And we can talk about that in a bit more detail. So this is expected to ease on-market transactions and even hostile takeovers, should the M&A landscape choose to develop that way.
Your last bit, I'm very curious about on hostile takeovers. Could you expand on that a bit?
So, typically in a hostile takeover, there is an on-market purchase prior to the open offer, which is, launched as per the SEBI regulations. And this stake build is often done, surreptitiously, so that there is an element of surprise. It is not consensual discussion between the parties. And the pre-amendment regime required the CCI approval to be taken at the stage of the stake build from the market or the pre-acquisition prior to launching the takeover offer. In fact, this was there at the time of SCM Soilfert and MCFL, which is Deepak Fertilizers and MCFL, far back in 2014-15. And they had purchased shares on the market before they launched the open offer. And it was then discovered that it was always intended. And therefore, the CCI penalized them, even though the shares were held in escrow, saying that you could not have purchased the shareholding on the stock market without CCI approval, and that it was interlinked to the open offer, which was launched. So there has been precedent where these things have happened and the CCI has actually gone after them and penalized. But now with the amendment, it is possible to purchase a certain stake on the stock market without prior CCI approval, provided you make an application to the CCI in the relevant form within 30 days of the first on-market purchase.
Okay, so
And there are certain other conditions as well, which we can talk about in a bit more detail.
Okay. Uh, well, I want to ask you that there was a lot of talk about uh, feedback taken from the industry. Do you think feedback from the industry has been incorporated in these amendments that have, of course, every time a new law is, sort of brought, objections and suggestions are invited from stakeholders. But that's the process. Uh, but sometimes they are papered over also. Not everything find its way into the law. And we have seen suggested amendments may not be accepted. Do you think what has been the demand of the industry has sort of been looked at closely by the bureaucracy when this law was being drafted? What is your observation of this?
So, in the large part, these amendments come on the back of the Competition Law Review Committee exercise, which was an extensive exercise with the CCI, various experts, etc. And the report produced by them was very comprehensive, having considered all sorts of international positions, as well as the kind of feedback that stakeholders were providing. So, in fact, for example, this derogation of standstill has come from feedback from stakeholders. It was not something that the CCI had initially considered, but it came through the process. Now, there are other changes which have been made in the part of these amendments, which I don't think either the CCI or the parties would have been 100% happy with either way. But those are part of the process. And I think overall there has been a robust consultation process which has taken place over the last several years, including of the rule draft combination regulations, as well as the as well as the rules which have been now notified. And in fact, some of the suggestions on, for example, substantial business operations uh, incorporate the changes suggested by stakeholders. So, the CCI, I think, and the government have been judicious and balanced in adopting some and not adopting others. So, I think there has been a consideration provided to these amendments through stakeholder consultations.
Could you reflect on in a bit on which are the areas in which entities involved in M&A are not required to notify to the CCI? Anything that you want to add to that?
So I think there are multiple sort of ways of looking. I think typically now what we are doing is we look at substantial business operations first to see if the transaction would either fall in the substantial qualify for substantial business operations or the de minimis small target exemption. And if either of those are not met, then we don't need to consider much more. So, for example, I have a small target which does not have 500 crore turnover or 500 crore GMV, nor does it qualify for 10% of users or 10% of global turnover or global GMV. In those circumstances, I would assume that I don't need to look at the entire deal value because these are objective parameters that have been looked at. Similarly, where the assets are below 450 crores and the turnover is below 1250 crores, uh, or the turnover is below 1250 crores, again, we don't need to look at the transaction. Now, there will be
Okay.
transactions who will cross these thresholds and require notification. However, there are certain categories of transactions that the government has, through rules, exempted, provided certain conditions are met. And there is a long laundry list of 14 or 15 of um, such exemptions, from minority acquisitions to stake sort of creeping acquisitions of up to 5%, or even when you're over 50%, going to say 100%, provided there is no change in control. I think what has become very important to assess is that there is no change in control, and that's where actually the complexity arises, because I think every law has a different interpretation of control. And I think perhaps the CCI's interpretation of control, as it has developed over the years and now codified in the Amendment Act, is more stringent and narrow than say SEBI would look at it. So CCI will look at, the ability to exercise material influence. Now, material influence is a very circumstantial, set of considerations that you have to evaluate each transaction for. There will be times, as there was in the Ultratech JP transaction, where Mr. Birla's presence on the board, because he was a, member of the family, extended family, plus an influential business leader, um, was considered to be material influence held by Ultratech over, Century Textiles. So I think it's going to be seen on a case by case basis, but the threshold as codified in the law now is material influence, which is much, much lower than both de jure and de facto control.
What will be the overall review period for each of these transactions that will happen after the compliances have been done? Is there a limit to a review? How many months? Uh,
Sure, sure. So I think the CCI filing process requires collation of a lot of data and information. So parties actually take 6 to 8 weeks to put everything together. Um, because it requires a lot of deep diving and getting a lot of information together and putting forth arguments on various relevant markets. Once the CCI receives the application, typically what they do is within the first 5, 6 working days, they review it and issue a defects notice where they point out what additional information is required to make the notice complete. Parties will provide this information, and the CCI has the ability to either accept it and say the form is complete, or they can issue a continuing defects letter asking for additional details. Now, every time a defects letter is issued, the clock stops. So if you could be 4 days in, and then the clock stays at 4 till the parties respond.
okay.
So this can result in a lot of negotiation or varied understanding on what stage of review we are at. But the law now provides that at the 30-day mark, if the CCI hasn't approved the transaction or issued a show cause notice saying there are concerns, then the transaction would be deemed to be approved. This is a bit like, the HSR in the US, HSR filings, where there's a no action period. So 30 days, if the 30 days lapses and a second request doesn't come, then in those circumstances, the transaction can go ahead.
I want to ask you two questions. You can answer both back to back first. What more changes could be done? Because in India, amendments do happen frequently. We are willing to improve where we feel we should, where there is a scope. Secondly, given a huge influx of foreign capital in India, uh, say in the year 2025-26, and the latter part of this, the residual part of this financial year, how is the mergers and acquisitions landscape according to you? What do you foresee? Both of these questions.
So let me take the second one first. I think, following the elections earlier this year, there is a lot of confidence and certainty, which is continued in India. And there is much to be said about the stability which, a majoritarian government provides. And, given various sort of moves and various programs that have been initiated by the government, whether it's the PLI scheme, whether it's Make in India, Digital India, I think there is going to be a renewed focus on ensuring that this economic agenda is delivered. And a lot of the government's sort of initiatives have been to further make doing business in India easy. And I think part of the competition amendments which have come through are aimed to address those, whilst not compromising the fact that there are going to be reviews of our law and the rule of law in India will prevail. With this sort of backdrop, I would say that, the key factors in which will influence M&A, in my view, and this is my personal view, would be, increased PE activity, ongoing digitization across various sectors, And there could also be sort of consolidation in certain sectors which are, say asset heavy. You are seeing that in the cement industry, you can see that in the telecom industry. Those traditional industries, I think, will see consolidation. In addition, I feel now that the CCI has the ability to review these transactions under the deal value threshold. A lot more of the tech and pharma and infrastructure transactions will also sort of come into the purview. And I do anticipate there will be, increased activity, given, especially on the tech side, there's, a great push on AI, fintech, cloud computing, e-commerce, and, the private capital influx along with the Digital India push will facilitate a lot more activity, I would say. And to the
Thank
other
you for yes.
question, which actually dovetails with this one, is that, look, there is a lot currently on the agenda for regulatory change, especially on the digital side. We have the Digital India Act, which has been proposed. We also have the Digital Competition Bill, which has been proposed. And of course, the DPDP Act is also to be implemented. So there's a lot changing on the landscape in terms of amendments, and that will change and impact the way business is done. I don't think we have fully fathomed the compliance cost of these new laws in terms of what needs to change at the ground level within a business in order to structurally also comply, not only behaviorally. So I think there's a lot which is upcoming. And of course, the government is constantly reviewing the Companies Act and the IBC to ensure there is effectiveness and ease through those. So I think the agenda for legislative change is pretty full as far as corporate India is concerned. And we need to see how these pan out. Sometimes too much too soon is too much to cope with.
So you're saying that what's happened is good, and as times go forward, there will be further changes, keeping it up with the need of the times.
Yes.
Thank you for explaining, and this was a brief explainer on the amendments, how this plays out. We will maybe get to do a review show on this a couple of months down the line. But Shweta, thank you for joining on the show, explaining these things to the viewers. And in the viewers, thank you for joining. Thank you so very much.